I'm Melanie Smith. I have been with GCFA since December, so kind of an interesting time to enter the Methodist Church and GCFA, but a great one nonetheless. I come through the background of corporate events and private events, so lots of different experiences. And here at GCFA, I am the travel and meeting planner for really anybody within the connection. So like Jackie mentioned, feel free to reach out using the chat with any questions. And then we'll also, my presentation is about 20 minutes on just some general information that I wanted to share with everyone that I get a lot of questions about. And then we'll pop into some Q&A and some opportunities for you all to share. And virtual brainstormings are always a great part of this interesting time. So first, make certain things are working. We'll just hop into 3 different buckets of events that I just want everybody to kind of have a baseline of. So it will inform what we're talking about going forward and also give you some opportunities to think about different things. For those of you who got to join Andrew Jensen's Q&A 2 weeks ago, he spoke a lot about how now's a creative time to where we can really look into different ways to do things and better ways to do things, or just completely shake it up. So it's a benefit. It's also a challenge, right? We love to stick with the status quo because it's what we know, but now's forcing us all out of our comfort zone. So our comfort zone a lot within the UMC is live events. So we have these in-person meetings, which are all face-to-face, right? So these are going to be our normal annual conferences, which tend to be the most effective form of communication for attendees and getting work accomplished, and also the attendee experience, right? One of the big benefits of an annual conference is you all get to come together at least once a year to talk about different ideas, to discuss the business of the conference, and really gain those relationships. So live events are never going to go away. Right now, we of course can't have them, but they're not going to go away. They still are going to be around. So that leads us into the virtual events where we're at right now with so much being uncertain and such. They are the most effective and efficient way to have the meetings that we need to have and get the work accomplished that we need to. So one of the benefits of virtual events are there's a faster turnaround. I know a lot of you all have decided in the last couple months about going virtual for your fall annual conferences or have already done it. Those are much easier and faster to plan because you don't have the things like contract negotiations or making certain that hotels have space for people or a conference center has space for the meeting, which all would have to be booked long in advance. Virtual meetings, whether they be for the full annual conference or just smaller meetings, can have a much faster turnaround. So that's one of the great benefits. There's no rule of thumb right now, but typically a virtual event is also going to come with a lower cost since there's not as many hard costs of things like staging and lighting and getting people places. So they tend to be a lower cost point, which is one of the big questions I get a lot is what type of costs do we need to consider? So I've got a slide a little bit later on. We'll get into better detail about that. And then also they have a broader reach. So I was on a meeting with Andrew Jensen, our production specialist and AD specialist yesterday, and he happened to mention that in the Tennessee Annual Conference, there's a church that is seeing regular attendees from Alaska. So it's also a great way to connect the broader church to what's going on in individual conferences. So it's got a great broad reach. And then the one, most people are familiar with live and virtual, obviously, right now. But hybrid events are one thing that I just want to bring up to start getting your gears turning, since a lot of what we're speaking about in the industry right now in travel and meetings are these hybrid events because they're going to be the future. This is not going away. COVID is not going away as much as we wish it were. That hasn't been the trajectory or plan, but there are still going to be those people who might not be comfortable coming to annual conference next year or might not be comfortable traveling, or just physically can't get somewhere. So hybrid events are a great way to where you combine both the face-to-face, which we're used to, that has that great engagement, and the virtual efficiency, fast turnaround together. So what this looks like is you might have a live stream of what's happening in person. So you'd still have the in-person event, might be smaller, right? Because social distancing guidelines or whatever your particular area has. Following those guidelines, it might have to be a smaller event, and then you could always live stream and have other elements that could get those virtual attendees involved, and still make them feel like they are part of the event, whether it be a virtual MC, working through networking, or even these breakout sessions for these attendees to really get the chance to say hey to each other after not seeing each other for so long. So hybrid events are something just to keep in the back of your mind going forward. Obviously this year, it's not likely that we're going to have a ton of in-person meetings. It's possible, depending on areas, but just something to think about for next year. So this diagram is something that came out in early or late March after Zoom meetings and other big meetings just came into play. That is a humorous example of why timing is everything in attendee experience of a virtual event. So as you can see in here, it says that the actual meeting content that people are focusing their attention span on is only about 2% during a meeting. Of course, this is very exaggerated, but we all are so familiar right now. I mean, obviously, every single one of you is on a virtual meeting right now. We're used to hearing the dog in the background or seeing the kid run through or like looking at your little square down at the bottom. And all of that comes into play and is a humorous example of actually talking about what timing means for an attendee experience in your virtual meeting. So there is this industry term of a 5-minute rule for engagement. So what this means, and one of the big things to consider, is how to keep the average adult attention span actually involved in your meeting is difficult. The next slide will talk about some tools to do that with, but this particular 5-minute rule for engagement is just saying the average adult attention span for an in-person meeting, and this is statistical, it was a Harvard Business Review article that I was reading, is 13 minutes, and that's for an in-person meeting. So if an in-person meeting where you physically can see the speaker and feel the same atmosphere that everyone else is feeling is only 13 minutes, imagine what that's like when you get a phone call from the bishop while you have an email coming in, while you have your kids screaming in the background. All of those things just compound distraction. So with virtual events, we really need to make certain that we are regularly checking in with the attendees. And this could look like anything. So say a worship service, for example, in an annual conference or any meeting you have, right, kind of follows a little bit of that same trajectory of these 5-minute rules for engagement. You might have a worship song that lasts 3 minutes, a 15 to 20-minute sermon, and then a 5-minute worship song to end with. All of that does kind of follow this regular interaction that people need to stay engaged in the event. Like I mentioned, the next slide will have some different tools, but even things like physical movement or saying hey to each other or giving breaks, all of those can break up in that 5-minute increment, which helps people stay more engaged in what's going on. Of course, this isn't always possible, right? If you're going through a piece of legislation, the likelihood of it taking less than 5 minutes with a vote is very, very low. So it's an ideal situation. It's not always going to happen. The next point is capping sessions at 2 to 2.5 hours. So this follows also that same psychological area where people can only focus on one topic for an extended amount of time for so long. So capping sessions, they found the sweet spot in most virtual meetings is 2 to 2.5 hours per topic. So within that, you will need to plan and stick to regular breaks. Psychologists recommend for every 1 hour, you have at least a 5-minute break. And then for every 2-hour session to 2.5-hour session, you give at least 20 minutes at that hour time frame. So the 5 minutes is an easy transition, right? You're going from one topic to another if you have a 1-hour session for one thing, and then you're going into another. But if you are going to commit to having a longer session because that's what your agenda requires, it's really important to give people those bio breaks, to give them the opportunity to go and grab a snack, just so they can continue. If you think about your live event, you're doing that just about the same as well. So kind of keeping that same pattern for a virtual event is important. And then planning out the regular breaks. Jensen, if you didn't get a chance to watch the video or didn't get a chance to go to 2 weeks ago's Q&A session, we can send out that link again with the video, but he gave a great production schedule example. And actually planning in those breaks is super important because it, one, allows you some wiggle room in your timing, but two, allows people to anticipate something. So announcing them is super important too at the beginning, kind of give an overview of what the day will look like and how regularly people will have breaks, just so they can mentally plan for that and look forward to something. And then lastly, condensing information for timing is key, because what could have been a 60-minute in-person super engaging topic might be a little less so if you have to be virtual. So the general rule of thumb for an hour-long session that would be in person, ideally cut it to 45 minutes, however that may look. And that'll just help things go more smoothly and also give you the room for the breaks that are more needed in a virtual meeting than in person. One thing I didn't put on here, since mostly everybody here is annual conferences and focusing on that, but we are a global church. It's one of the great benefits of the United Methodist Church. So also considering timing in the sense of if you have a meeting that's in different time zones, think about what those people's day-to-day lives are like. If you're going to be a weekday and have a 9 a.m. Eastern time meeting, but you have people from California joining, maybe consider moving it to 11 to where it gives them time to get up and get going in the morning. So that brings us to actual engagement tactics. So the last two things that I've talked about are more theoretical, right, in terms of timing, being a specific, but how do you actually keep the people engaged with those 5-minute increment breaks, et cetera? These are just a lot of what I have either experienced through great training meetings in virtual events or spoken to many of my colleagues about, is different ways that people can feel involved even though we're not together, we're not there. You don't get to turn to Reverend so-and-so who you haven't seen in ages and say, hey. All of these ways keep that engagement at least somewhat there, which will allow people to have just overall a better attendee experience. So first of all, it always feels silly, but it's actually one of my favorite things, physical movement. So having Bishop or whoever's presiding say, okay, take a lap around your room where you're in, or everybody raise their hands and say hi. The physical movement element is something that we're used to in in-person events, right? You've got to get up and walk to say hello to somebody. That's something that you don't have to do when you're sitting in your desk chair in front of a computer, but it really does help get things going in terms of your mind, because physiologically, when we're moving, our brains are also being used in some different ways, and it gets different blood vessels going. So physical movement is a great way to just randomly have breaks and do something physical. And of course, not everybody can do that. Not everybody will do that, but offering it is always good. Feels silly at the time, but actually works. And then occasional attendee camera use. So this is something that, especially with an annual conference, you're talking about 1,000 people plus coming into a meeting. You're not going to have all those people in a tab. You're not going to see everybody. But occasionally either putting people in breakout rooms or having people turn on their camera to go find, the closest soap bottle or hand sanitizer or whatever it is, and show that keeps an accountability to the experience to make certain that people are involved so they're ready to do the work of the conference. And then different actual hard tools that I wanted to mention to you all just to think about are somewhat, the first few are within whatever platform you end up using. So there are all different platforms, which we can, of course, walk through GCFA. That would be more Andrew Jensen would help walk through different platforms and different benefits of different platforms. But most of what we're seeing right now for virtual event platforms, they have things like chats, Q&As, polling, hand raising, and breakout groups. Think about different ways that those can be used. Of course, the chats and Q&As might be great ways to do your motions or get your technical issues resolved and ask questions of the general conference. But they also could be great ways to be like, okay, tell us what your pet's name is, or just other things that can keep people, give people that opportunity to network. And of course, there needs to be a space for that, and there needs to be a time for that. You don't want that to be in the middle of a vote or anything, but utilizing those and even polling features within the system to get people involved and ask questions of something. What was your favorite part of that worship service? Was it the music? Was it the word? What resonated with you? All of those things can be ways to make certain and get some feedback whether or not people are actually listening and involved at that point. And same with hand raising, whether it be a virtual or a physical hand raise. Most softwares do have the virtual hand raise, which are great ways to just keep people engaged. Breakout groups, one of the things that I just want to say on this, they're great to do your work of the smaller committees and stuff that need to happen, of course. But also they're a great way to, during a longer break, give the opportunity to, hey, pop into this networking group and you breakout group for networking, and you can turn on your camera and have a chat. I would recommend, so there's the theory of if you can't be seen, you can't be heard, right? That you can kind of hide behind other people. So keeping those small and like maximum 10 is great for networking, because then everybody is more likely to get a chance to speak and an opportunity to actually connect with the other people in that group. And then the last point, the Pickles live stream chats and word clouds are just 3 creative ways that I've seen, especially utilizing during breaks, this community coming together. So Pickles is a online drawing doodle platform to where you can just ask people to submit how they're feeling or what they took away from that session, or etc. And then you can show all of those doodles, which are virtual doodles, right? And if anybody's ever done their virtual signature, it never looks the same. I tried to draw a sun this morning. It did not come out like that. I was going to put it on the side of this. We decided not to. But it's a great way to just kind of get little things involved and find out who's a great artist. And then live stream chats are another way that during breaks or something, you could put up a live stream chat. This would be more of that networking chat, not really the talking about the business of the conference, etc. But put that up so you can say hey to other people and just chat with other people without having to turn on video. And then word clouds are another great way, especially after things like worship. Hey, what was the biggest point that you took away? And then you could post that for everyone to see. So those are just some different tools. And then lastly, the 2 big things I wanted to chat about were virtual event costs to consider. I get this question a lot on, wow, a virtual event is going to be a whole lot cheaper than an in-person event. And usually that's true, but just a few different things to consider in terms of costs. So firstly, your platforms. These are going to be things like your license for whatever software you're using to do your streaming, to do your video, to do your chatting. That is going to come with a hard cost. I highly recommend, one of the best rule of thumb is getting at least 3 quotes for things. Of course, if you have something that everybody in your conference is familiar with, that's probably going to be the best way to go, because then you don't have training time associated. But I always recommend getting at least 3 quotes from different platforms. And then registration is another cost to consider. I get this question a lot. Do I need registration for my virtual event? Not really, right? You have everybody's email in a listserv somewhere in your database. You have that information. Technically, you don't need registration, but statistically, 55% of people are more likely to attend something if they commit to it. So getting the commitment and being able to have that roster of who you're anticipating attending is super important. Of course, for an annual conference, there are expectations of certain people to attend and requirements of certain people to attend. But say other meetings. Registration is a great way to get those on the books for people and have them commit to them. We use a great registration software called Eventry with GCFA that we offer to all of the annual conferences, of course, that allows us also to send out email blasts and updates and post-event surveys, et cetera. So all of those are important, which leads me to surveying real quick. It's not on here, but I just thought about it. Surveying pre and post-event with the attendee experience for virtual events are important because right now we don't have that data for most of the conferences, right? To find out how their attendee experience went, which will help inform, ideally, if we didn't have to do this next year, but if we did have to ever do another virtual annual conference or virtual event, they're good things to have. So registration is a great way to do that. My next slide, I'll talk a little bit about, do you charge for registration? And we'll chat about that. And then technical staffing and production staffing. So Andrew Denton gave some great examples of what production staffing looks like, as well as the technical staffing. So technical is going to be more that who's actually helping you with the platform itself. So Bishop presiding or whoever else is the speaker at that point doesn't have to click their own slides, doesn't have to monitor that chat. So they can really focus on their work. And then the production staffing is, how do we plan this? What would make sense? What would keep people engaged? What would make certain that we have those regular breaks and regular intervals? And what makes sense for people's day-to-day schedules? So those are just a few costs to consider, which leads me into, I love that Nancy did some difficult topics, because registration fees is a difficult topic because some conferences charge registration fees, others don't. Some people charge just for a single meal that people are going to, others charge nothing. So should you charge registration fees for a virtual event? From last slide, we obviously saw that there are costs associated with it. So it's less, right? And then an in-person, if you had hotel rooms or conference center rooms and staging and lighting and AV in person, it's likely going to be less. But so the statistic I shared of 55% of people who register are more likely to attend goes up to 85% if they have some financial stake in the game. I'm not saying that you should charge a lot of money. It again depends on the conference, etc. But even $1, having somebody be financially invested in a meeting, whether it be an annual conference or any other meeting, increases the likelihood of them coming, staying for the entire time, and being more involved. And then also, I always get a question about sponsorship of, would people sponsor a digital event? Yes, they would. There are different ways, and I'm happy to chat through that with any individual conference that may have sponsors. I'd love to chat through what that could look like for you all, just on a individual basis, but it is definitely possible. There are ways and places that you can put in abilities for sponsorship. So that just leads me to, right before we hop into Q&A, just my contact information, which will also come in a follow-up email, I'm certain, from Jackie. But this contact information, feel free to reach out to us if you have, even if you want to brainstorm through any of the things that I talked about. Again, this is high level. In detail of what that means for your conference, we're available to talk through that. And of course, available to assist in planning as well as executing your event.